Welcome to Whispered Empires, where history unfolds in the quiet hours between waking and sleep. Tonight, we journey into the war that shattered the old world and forged the modern age. A conflict so vast it could only be called the Great War. Before we descend into those trenches, into those lost years between 1914 and 1918, please consider subscribing to this channel and pressing the bell icon so you'll never miss our explorations through time's forgotten corridors. And if this story moves you, leave a like to help others discover these whispered histories. Now let us begin. The summer of 1914 arrived warm and golden across Europe, painting the continent in shades of promise and prosperity. From London to Vienna, from Paris to St. Petersburg, the season brought garden parties, seaside holidays, and an unshakable confidence in progress. The great European empires stood at their zenith, their flags fluttering over territories spanning the globe, their treasuries full, their armies dressed in brilliant uniforms designed for spectacle rather than concealment. Few could imagine that this same summer would mark the end of an era, that within months, this world of certainty would collapse into mud and blood. On June 28th, in the Bosnian city of Sarajevo, Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary rode through sun-dappled streets in an open car. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne had come to inspect military maneuvers, a routine imperial duty performed countless times before. His wife Sophie sat beside him, both dressed formally despite the heat. Along the route, among the curious crowds watching the motorcade pass, several young men waited with weapons concealed beneath their clothes. They belonged to a Serbian nationalist group called the Black Hand, committed to liberating Slavic peoples from imperial rule. One assassination attempt had already failed that morning. The Archduke's driver took a wrong turn onto Franz Joseph Street, then stopped to reverse direction. In that moment of confusion, 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip stepped forward from the crowd, raised a pistol and fired twice. The first bullet struck Sophie in the abdomen. The second pierced Franz Ferdinand's neck, severing his jugular vein. Within minutes, both were dead. Princip was immediately seized by police, pulled into custody before the crowd could tear him apart. He would never know that his 2 bullets had done more than kill an archduke. They had triggered a mechanism that would consume 10 million lives. The assassination's reverberations spread through Europe's network of alliances like cracks spreading across ice. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia for supporting the assassins and saw an opportunity to crush Serbian nationalism once and for all. Behind Austria stood Germany, eager to assert its power. Behind Serbia stood Russia, protector of Slavic peoples and rival to Austrian ambitions. Behind Russia stood France, bound by treaty and burning to reclaim territories lost to Germany in 1870. And watching from across the Channel, Britain maintained its centuries-old policy of preventing any single power from dominating the continent. The dominoes were arranged. Someone needed only to push the first. On July 23rd, Austria-Hungary delivered an ultimatum to Serbia with demands so severe they were designed to be rejected. Serbia accepted most terms but balked at allowing Austrian officials to conduct investigations on Serbian soil, a violation of sovereignty no nation could accept. Austria-Hungary declared war on July 28th, exactly 1 month after the assassinations. Artillery shells fell on Belgrade that same evening, orange blossoms of flame lighting the night sky. Russia began mobilizing its vast armies. Germany demanded Russia cease mobilization, received no reply, and declared war on August 1st. The mechanism was in motion now, unstoppable, grinding toward catastrophe with the inevitability of machinery. France and Germany stood on opposite sides of ancient enmity, their mutual hatred forged over centuries and tempered by the Franco-Prussian War's humiliations. When Germany declared war on France on August 3rd, the German military activated a plan developed over years of meticulous preparation. The Schlieffen Plan called for a massive right hook through neutral Belgium, sweeping around Paris from the north, while holding defensive positions against the French in the south. Speed was essential. Germany needed to defeat France quickly before Russia's slow-moving millions could mobilize fully. The plan was elegant, comprehensive, and contained within it the seeds of its own failure. Germany's invasion of Belgium on August 4th brought Britain into the war. Britain had guaranteed Belgian neutrality through treaties signed decades earlier, and more importantly, Britain could not permit Germany to control the Channel ports. In London, Foreign Secretary Edward Grey stood at his window as evening fell and spoke words that would become famous. "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." He was right. That night, as Britain declared war on Germany, the old world ended. What would replace it remained unknown, hidden beyond horizons dark with approaching storm clouds. Across Europe, crowds gathered in city squares, cheering declarations of war with enthusiasm that now seems incomprehensible. In Berlin, Vienna, Paris, London, and St. Petersburg, young men rushed to recruiting offices, terrified the war would end before they could experience its glory. They had grown up on stories of quick, decisive conflicts, wars that lasted weeks, not years. They imagined cavalry charges and brave assaults, medals and homecomings, the thrilling clarity of combat. They could not conceive of machine guns firing 600 rounds per minute, of artillery shells that turned Earth into moonscapes, of trenches stretching from Switzerland to the sea. They would learn soon enough. The German army that swept into Belgium in August 1914 was the most powerful military force assembled in human history to that point. Nearly 1 million men advanced in field gray uniforms, supported by horse-drawn artillery and supply trains stretching back miles. They moved with clockwork precision through Belgian villages, following rail lines and roads toward France. But immediately, the plan encountered friction that its architects had not anticipated. Belgian resistance was fiercer than expected. British Expeditionary Force regulars, though vastly outnumbered, fought with professional skill that slowed the advance. And most critically, the logistical challenges of moving such massive forces proved more difficult than maps suggested. By early September, German forces had advanced deep into France, pushing toward Paris in a crescendo of violence that left Belgian and French towns in ruins. Refugees streamed ahead of the advancing army, carrying what they could, leaving behind homes and histories. The French government abandoned Paris for Bordeaux, preparing for the capital's fall. But the German First Army, commanded by Alexander von Kluck, made a crucial error. Instead of encircling Paris from the west as the Schlieffen Plan dictated, von Kluck turned southeast, pursuing what he believed were defeated French forces. This exposed his flank to forces defending Paris. The error would prove decisive. The Battle of the Marne began on September 6th, when French and British forces counterattacked the German flank along a front stretching nearly 200 miles. For 3 days, armies clashed in confusion and chaos, units losing contact with headquarters, commanders making decisions based on hours-old information. At the critical moment, the French military governor of Paris requisitioned every taxi in the city, hundreds of vehicles, to rush reinforcements to the front, a scene at once desperate and absurd. The Germans fell back to defensive positions along the Aisne River. Paris was saved. The Schlieffen Plan had failed, and with its failure, any hope of a quick war died. Both sides now attempted to outflank each other to the north in what became known as the Race to the Sea. Armies leapfrogged northward, seeking open flanks, finding none. By November, continuous lines of trenches stretched from the Swiss border to the English Channel, roughly 400 miles of fortified positions separated by no man's land varying from 50 yards to half a mile across. This western front would barely move for the next 3 years despite battles involving millions of men and producing casualties on scales previously unimaginable. Soldiers who had marched singing in August now dug into earth, building elaborate systems of trenches that became cities of mud, cities of death. Life in the trenches followed rhythms determined by survival and military routine. Frontline trenches faced the enemy, connected to support and reserve trenches by communication trenches running perpendicular to the front. Soldiers spent 4 to 6 days in frontline positions, then rotated back to reserve areas. The trenches themselves were 6 to 8 feet deep, narrow enough that 2 men could barely pass. Duckboards lined the floors, often floating in water. The walls were reinforced with sandbags, timber, corrugated iron, whatever materials could be found. Dugouts provided shelter from shelling, though a direct hit from heavy artillery could bury occupants alive. The daily routine in the trenches began before dawn with stand-to, when all men took positions on the firing step, rifles ready, bayonets fixed, awaiting potential attack in the vulnerable twilight. After an hour, with daylight full, stand down was called. Breakfast followed, usually tea, bread, perhaps tinned meat. Then came the work of maintaining the trench. Filling sandbags, repairing parapets damaged by shelling, pumping water, clearing mud, recovering bodies from no man's land under cover of darkness. Snipers watched for any careless exposure of heads above parapets. Artillery duels erupted sporadically, shells screaming overhead to explode in geysers of earth and steel fragments. Evening brought another stand to, then darkness and the work of war. Between the opposing trenches lay no man's land, a wasteland of shell craters, tangled barbed wire, and decomposing corpses that armies could not recover. It was perhaps the most terrible landscape human beings had ever created. A killing ground swept by machine gun fire and illuminated at night by flares that hung suspended from small parachutes, casting everything in stark, flickering shadows. In this space, patrols moved carefully after dark, gathering intelligence, repairing wire, sometimes engaging in small, vicious firefights. The bodies of men killed in previous battles remained where they fell, gradually becoming part of the earth, monuments to battles whose names and purposes were already forgotten. The weapons of this war were products of industrial civilization turned toward destruction. Machine guns like the British Vickers or German Maxim could fire 500 rounds per minute, though in practice they fired in short bursts to prevent overheating. A single gun could kill dozens of men crossing open ground. Artillery dominated the battlefield, French 75mm field guns, German 150mm howitzers, British 18-pounders. Heavy siege guns could hurl shells weighing hundreds of pounds miles behind enemy lines. The war consumed shells at rates quartermaster generals had never imagined, creating shortages that political careers and drove innovations in production. This was industrialized killing, assembly line death. Poison gas made its first major appearance at Ypres in April 1915, when German forces released chlorine from cylinders along a 4-mile front. Heavier than air, the greenish-yellow cloud drifted across no man's land toward French colonial troops, who had no protection and no understanding of what approached. Those who inhaled the gas drowned on dry land as the chlorine reacted with moisture in their lungs to form hydrochloric acid. Thousands died. Thousands more were permanently damaged. The line broke, but German forces were unprepared to exploit the gap, and the front stabilized. Both sides quickly adopted gas warfare. Phosgene, mustard gas, and other agents followed. Gas masks became standard equipment, giving soldiers the appearance of insects, dehumanized, anonymous. In the East, the war took different forms across vast distances. Germany and Austria-Hungary faced Russia across fronts extending from the Baltic to Romania. Distances so immense that armies could still maneuver, that cavalry remained relevant, that breakthrough and exploitation retained possibilities. Russia entered the war with vast manpower but inadequate equipment, poor transportation infrastructure, and a military leadership hampered by corruption and incompetence. In August 1914, Russia invaded East Prussia with 2 armies, seeking to draw German forces away from the Western Front. The invasion initially succeeded, penetrating deep into German territory. But German commanders Hindenburg and Ludendorff orchestrated a masterful counterattack at Tannenberg, encircling and destroying the Russian Second Army. The Battle of Tannenberg in August 1914 resulted in Russian casualties exceeding 150,000, with 90,000 taken prisoner. Russian Second Army commander General Samsonov walked into the forest and shot himself, unable to bear the magnitude of defeat. Tannenberg became legendary in Germany, transforming Hindenburg and Ludendorff into national heroes. But the victory did not knock Russia from the war. The empire's vast reserves of manpower allowed it to absorb catastrophic losses and continue fighting. Throughout 1915, German and Austrian forces pushed the Russians back hundreds of miles, capturing Poland and inflicting casualties approaching 2 million. Yet Russia's armies remained in the field, retreating but not breaking, maintaining pressure that prevented Germany from concentrating all forces in the West. Austria-Hungary's war against Serbia, the conflict that had ignited this global conflagration, developed into its own nightmare. Austrian forces invaded Serbia in August 1914, expecting quick victory over a smaller, poorly equipped opponent. Instead, Serbian forces fought with desperate courage, inflicting humiliating defeats on Austrian armies at Ser Mountain and the Kolubara River. Not until German forces joined the offensive in October 1915 did the Central Powers finally overrun Serbia. But the victory cost Austria-Hungary dearly, exposing the empire's military weaknesses and ethnic tensions. Croatian, Czech, and Romanian units showed questionable loyalty, sometimes surrendering en masse. The empire was beginning to fragment from within, its internal contradictions stressed beyond endurance. Italy's entry into the war in May 1915 opened another front along the Austria-Hungary border, in mountains where soldiers fought amid glaciers and avalanches, where artillery had to be hauled up precipitous slopes, where men froze to death in trenches carved from stone. Italy had been allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary before the war but remained neutral in 1914, then negotiated with both sides, finally joining the Allies in exchange for promises of territorial gains. Italian Chief of Staff Luigi Cadorna launched a series of offensives along the Isonzo River, attempting to break through Austrian defenses toward Trieste. 11 battles were fought along the Isonzo over 30 months, each gaining little ground and costing thousands of lives. The mountains turned red with Italian and Austrian blood. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire entered the war in November 1914 on the side of Germany, seeking to reclaim lost glory and threatened by Russian expansion. The Ottomans controlled territories stretching from the Balkans through Anatolia to Mesopotamia, Arabia, and Palestine, lands of ancient civilizations, now contested again. British Empire forces, including Indian and Anzac troops, invaded Mesopotamia, seeking to protect oil supplies and potentially advance on Constantinople. In April 1915, British Empire forces landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula in an audacious attempt to force the Dardanelles Strait, knock the Ottoman Empire from the war, and open a supply route to Russia. The campaign was Churchill's conception, brilliant in theory, catastrophic in execution. At Gallipoli, British, Australian, and New Zealand troops came ashore on April 25 into murderous fire from Ottoman defenders commanded by Mustafa Kemal, an officer who would later found modern Turkey. The invaders clung to narrow beaches overlooked by hills where Ottoman machine guns commanded every approach. For 8 months, fighting raged in heat and dust, among scrubland that offered no cover. Dysentery and typhoid killed as many as bullets. In the trenches, opposing lines were sometimes separated by mere yards, close enough to throw grenades into enemy positions. No breakthrough came. In January 1916, Allied forces evacuated in the only successful phase of the campaign. Gallipoli cost over 500,000 casualties and achieved nothing. The war at sea developed into a different type of contest, one of blockade and counterblockade, of submarines and destroyers, of commerce raiding and convoy protection. The Royal Navy's Grand Fleet maintained a distant blockade of Germany from bases in Scotland, controlling access to the Atlantic. Germany's High Seas Fleet remained largely confined to port, venturing out occasionally for raids and skirmishes but unwilling to risk decisive battle against superior forces. The blockade slowly strangled Germany, preventing imports of food and raw materials, contributing to civilian suffering and eventual collapse. But Germany possessed a weapon that could strike back, the submarine or U-boat, capable of sinking merchant vessels carrying supplies to Britain. Unrestricted submarine warfare, attacking merchant ships without warning, violated established rules of naval warfare, and risked bringing neutral nations into the conflict. Germany implemented such warfare in February 1915, then suspended it after international protests, then resumed it again in February 1917 in a desperate gamble to starve Britain before American intervention could prove decisive. U-boats prowled shipping lanes, hunting alone, using periscopes to identify targets, firing torpedoes that struck without warning. Merchant vessels sank with their crews, often with no chance to launch lifeboats. The tonnage of Allied shipping sunk mounted month by month, approaching the threshold where Britain's survival would be threatened. Only the development of convoy systems finally reduced losses to sustainable levels. The only major fleet engagement of the war occurred at Jutland in May 1916, when the German High Seas Fleet sortied into the North Sea and encountered the British Grand Fleet. For one afternoon, Dreadnoughts and battle cruisers exchanged fire at ranges exceeding 10 miles. Their massive shells producing waterspouts hundreds of feet high when they missed, catastrophic explosions when they struck. British battle cruisers proved vulnerable, 3 exploding when shells penetrated their magazines. Germany inflicted heavier casualties and sank more tonnage. But when night fell and battle ended, the High Seas Fleet retreated to port and never again seriously challenged British control. Strategically, Jutland changed nothing. Germany remained blockaded. Britain remained dominant. The fleet actions both sides had anticipated never materialized. In Africa, colonial forces fought their own campaigns across landscapes ranging from desert to jungle. German East Africa, under the command of Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, conducted a guerrilla campaign that lasted the entire war. Outnumbered and cut off from resupply, von Lettow-Vorbeck led British, South African, Belgian, and Portuguese forces on a 4-year chase across thousands of miles, tying down forces needed elsewhere. He surrendered only after learning the war in Europe had ended. Other German colonies fell more quickly. South Africa captured German Southwest Africa. British Empire forces took German West Africa and Cameroon. These campaigns involved relatively few European troops but drew in hundreds of thousands of African soldiers and carriers, spreading the war to populations who had no voice in its causes. By 1916, all sides recognized this war would not end quickly. The initial enthusiasm had curdled into grim determination. Governments mobilized entire economies for war production. Women entered factories by the millions, filling positions left by men at the front, challenging social conventions that had seemed permanent. Rationing controlled food distribution. Censorship suppressed dissent. Propaganda portrayed enemies as monsters, battles as glorious. But beneath the official narratives, populations grew weary. The casualties mounted into incomprehensible numbers. Every village lost sons. Every city held wounded veterans, men with missing limbs, scarred faces, minds shattered by experiences that peace had no vocabulary to describe. Still the war continued, its momentum unstoppable. On February 21, 1916, German forces launched a massive offensive against the French fortress complex at Verdun, a city on the Meuse River that had symbolic importance to France. German Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn conceived the attack not to break through but to bleed France white, to create a battle of attrition where superior German artillery could inflict unbearable casualties. The offensive began with a bombardment from 1,200 guns firing along an 8-mile front, the most intense artillery concentration yet seen. For 10 hours, shells fell continuously, 2 shells per second, the sound audible 100 miles away. When infantry advanced, they found French defenses devastated. Yet French soldiers emerged from deep dugouts to resist with suicidal courage. The Battle of Verdun consumed both armies for 10 months, becoming a furnace that transformed men into casualties at horrifying rates. French forces defended with the determination of those protecting sacred ground. Artillery dominated the battlefield to an extent never before witnessed. 70% of casualties came from shell fragments rather than bullets. The landscape around Verdun became lunar, all vegetation destroyed, villages erased, even the dead blown apart by subsequent shelling. French commander Philippe Pétain organized a supply system that rotated units through the battle, ensuring most French soldiers served at Verdun, making it a shared national trauma. "They shall not pass" became the French rallying cry, and indeed they did not pass. But the cost approached 700,000 casualties combined. To relieve pressure on Verdun, British and French forces launched an offensive along the Somme River in July 1916. British commander Douglas Haig believed a week-long preliminary bombardment by 1,500 guns would destroy German defenses and allow infantry to walk across no man's land to occupy empty trenches. The bombardment fired 1.7 million shells over 7 days, creating a din that drowned thought. British soldiers, many volunteers with minimal training, were told the wire would be cut, the Germans killed or stunned. They believed it. On the morning of July 1st, they climbed from their trenches and walked forward in lines, carrying 70 pounds of equipment, confident in victory. They walked into the deadliest day in British military history. German soldiers emerged from deep dugouts where they had survived the bombardment, brought up machine guns, and opened fire into the advancing British ranks. Men fell in swaths, like grain before a scythe. Some units lost 90% casualties before reaching German lines. By day's end, British forces had suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, 20,000 dead, for minimal territorial gains. It was a catastrophe of planning and execution, yet Haig continued the offensive for 4 more months. The Battle of the Somme finally ended in November with Allied forces having advanced roughly 6 miles at cost of over 1 million casualties combined. The losses accomplished nothing decisive, achieved no breakthrough, changed no strategic calculations. Among the innovations introduced at the Somme were tanks, metal monsters that crawled on caterpillar treads, immune to machine gun fire, capable of crushing barbed wire and crossing trenches. The British deployed 49 Mark I tanks on September 15, 1916, primitive, unreliable machines that broke down frequently, moved at walking pace, became death traps when penetrated by shells. But they terrified German soldiers who had never encountered such weapons. The tank represented a solution to the tactical problem that had deadlocked the Western Front. Properly designed and employed in sufficient numbers, tanks could restore mobility to warfare. But in 1916 they were too few and too flawed. Their potential remained unrealized. The war would continue its grinding attrition for 2 more years. The Eastern Front in 1916 witnessed Russia's last great offensive. In June, General Alexei Brusilov attacked Austrian positions in Galicia with tactics emphasizing speed, surprise, and decentralized command. The Brusilov offensive initially achieved spectacular success, breaking through Austrian lines, advancing up to 60 miles, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Austrian armies reeled toward collapse. Romania, encouraged by Russian success, entered the war on the Allied side in August. But German reinforcements stabilized the front. Russian logistics couldn't sustain the advance. The offensive ground down into familiar attrition. By September, Russia had suffered 1.5 million casualties. The offensive exhausted Russian reserves and accelerated the erosion of army morale that would culminate in revolution. Throughout the war, airplane technology evolved from fragile reconnaissance craft to specialized fighters, bombers, and ground attack planes. Early in the war, pilots from opposing sides would wave to each other, seeing themselves as members of an elite fraternity above the squalor below. That chivalry disappeared as aircraft mounted machine guns. The Germans initially gained advantage with the Fokker Eindecker, which synchronized machine gun fire through the propeller. Allied pilots flew inferior aircraft through Fokker scourge months in 1915 and early 1916, suffering heavy casualties. Then Allied designs improved: the British Sopwith Camel, the French SPAD, the German Fokker Dr. I triplane. Aces like the Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen, became famous, their brightly painted planes distinctive in sky battles called dogfights. Strategic bombing began hesitantly with German Zeppelin raids on London and Paris, bringing war directly to civilian populations for the first time. The enormous rigid airships could carry significant bomb loads and operated above the ceiling of early fighters. Night raids produced terror disproportionate to the damage inflicted. But Zeppelins proved vulnerable once defending fighters reached their operating altitude. The hydrogen-filled airships burst into flames when tracer bullets ignited their gas cells, falling like comets while crews screamed inside. Germany then developed heavy bombers, Gotha, and giant multi-engine aircraft that could reach London from bases in Belgium. Air raid sirens, blackouts, and bomb shelters became part of civilian life. The distinction between front and home front blurred. By early 1917, all sides approached exhaustion. The war had cost millions of lives and consumed wealth accumulated over decades. Yet no one knew how to stop. The Russian Empire teetered on collapse, its army demoralized, its economy in ruins, its people starving. In March, revolution erupted in Petrograd. Soldiers refused orders to fire on demonstrators. The Tsar abdicated. A provisional government attempted to continue the war while implementing democratic reforms, an impossible balancing act that satisfied no one. In the countryside and trenches, Bolsheviks agitated with simple promises: peace, land, bread. Vladimir Lenin, exiled in Switzerland, saw opportunity. Germany, recognizing a chance to knock Russia from the war, facilitated Lenin's return in a sealed train. Revolution and war fed each other, spiraling toward catastrophe. Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare in February 1917 brought predictable consequences. American ships were sunk. American lives were lost. Public opinion, already sympathetic to the Allies, turned decisively against Germany. British intelligence intercepted and decrypted the Zimmermann telegram, a German diplomatic message proposing alliance with Mexico against the United States, promising Mexican recovery of territories lost in the 19th century. Published in American newspapers, the telegram destroyed remaining neutralist sentiment. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. American industry, American credit, and eventually American manpower would tip the balance. But mobilization required time. Through 1917, the Allies had to endure while American strength was gathered and transported across submarine-infested seas. French forces launched an offensive in April 1917 along the Chemin de Dames Ridge, designed by Robert Nivelle, who promised breakthrough within 48 hours. Nivelle had earned fame at Verdun and possessed absolute confidence in his plan. He was wrong. German intelligence learned of the attack. German defenses were formidable. French soldiers, promised easy victory, instead encountered slaughter reminiscent of the Somme. Within days, the offensive collapsed with horrifying casualties. Nivelle was dismissed, but the damage extended beyond tactical failure. French soldiers, betrayed too often by incompetent leadership, began refusing orders to attack. Mutinies spread through the French army during spring 1917, entire units refusing to leave trenches, though maintaining defensive positions. Authorities suppressed the mutinies with executions and reforms. New French commander Philippe Pétain rebuilt army morale through improved conditions, more leave, less pointless offensives. He adopted a defensive posture. We wait for the Americans and the tanks. But while France licked its wounds, Britain bore offensive burden. Douglas Haig planned another offensive in Flanders, toward the Belgian town of Passchendaele, aiming to break through to the Channel coast. The offensive began with successful attacks on Messines Ridge in June, where British forces detonated 19 massive mines under German positions, simultaneous explosions of nearly 1 million pounds of high explosive that were heard in London, that killed 10,000 men instantly, that created craters still visible today. It was the most destructive non-nuclear man-made explosion in history. The Third Battle of Ypres, known as Passchendaele, began on July 31st with promising gains. Then the weather broke. Rain fell steadily for days, then weeks. The battlefield became a swamp. Shell craters filled with water. Men drowned in mud. Tanks bogged down and became targets. Still, Haig continued attacking through August, September, October, each assault gaining yards at cost of thousands of lives. The village of Passchendaele finally fell on November 6th after Canadian forces fought through conditions almost beyond description. British casualties exceeded 250,000. German casualties approached equal numbers. The offensive gained roughly 5 miles. Winston Churchill later wrote that nearly all the commanders were convinced that success was impossible. Nevertheless, they followed orders and carried out the offensive with determination and discipline. In Russia, the Bolsheviks seized power in November 1917 through a coup that later propaganda would transform into mass revolution. Lenin's government immediately sought peace with Germany, willing to accept almost any terms to extract Russia from the war. Armistice negotiations began in December at Brest-Litovsk. Germany demanded massive territorial concessions: Poland, the Baltic states, Ukraine, Finland. Leon Trotsky, leading Russian negotiations, attempted to stall, hoping for revolution to spread to Germany. But German patience ended. In February 1918, German forces advanced deep into Russia against collapsing resistance. Russia capitulated. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed March 3rd, stripped Russia of territories containing 1/3 of its population and most of its industry. Germany could now transfer millions of troops to the Western Front for final offensives. The collapse of Russia brought joy to Central Powers and despair to allies. But Germany's triumph contained seeds of its own defeat. Occupying captured territories required manpower. Ukraine's promised grain failed to materialize due to disruption and resistance. The treaty's harshness revealed German war aims and stiffened Allied determination. And critically, the flow of American forces to France accelerated through early 1918. By summer, 10,000 American soldiers arrived daily. Time was running out for Germany. German commanders Hindenburg and Ludendorff recognized they must stake everything on offensives in the West before American strength became overwhelming. They prepared attacks using new infiltration tactics. Small groups bypassing strongpoints, penetrating deep, creating chaos. It was Germany's last chance for victory. The German Spring Offensive launched on March 21, 1918, with an attack on British positions along the Somme. After a 5-hour bombardment of unprecedented intensity using poison gas and high explosive, German stormtroopers advanced through fog. They penetrated British lines, advancing up to 40 miles in some sectors, the deepest gains since 1914. British forces fell back in disorder. Paris came under threat from German long-range artillery. But German logistics couldn't sustain the advance. Troops exhausted themselves pursuing retreating enemies. Supply lines stretched beyond breaking. Casualties mounted without decisive breakthrough. By April, the offensive stalled. Germany launched 4 more offensives through June, each initially successful, each ultimately failing to achieve breakthrough. Germany had shot its bolt. The Allies appointed French General Ferdinand Foch as supreme commander to coordinate response to German offensives. Foch had survived earlier failures, learned from them, and possessed the resolution necessary for this moment. He recognized German attacks were hemorrhaging German strength. Once German offensives exhausted themselves, Allies could counterattack with superiority in numbers, especially with American forces arriving in overwhelming numbers. The transition came in July during the Second Battle of the Marne. When German forces attacked, they encountered prepared defenses in depth. Allied counterattacks, spearheaded by tanks and fresh American divisions, drove Germans back. After 4 years of defensive fighting, Allied forces finally seized initiative. They would not relinquish it. The 100 Days Offensive, beginning August 8, 1918, broke the German army. British, French, Canadian, Australian, and American forces attacked along multiple sectors, using tanks in hundreds, coordinating with aircraft, employing artillery creeping barrages that infantry followed closely. German defenses, undermanned and demoralized, collapsed sector by sector. Ludendorff called August 8 the Black Day of the German Army, as entire divisions surrendered or dissolved. Through August and September, Allied forces advanced steadily, recapturing territories lost earlier in the year, breaching the Hindenburg Line, Germany's prepared defensive system. The tide had turned irreversibly, but the fighting remained brutal, casualties mounting even as victory approached. Peace would not come gently. Germany's allies collapsed one by one through autumn 1918. Bulgaria signed armistice in September after Allied forces advancing from Greece broke through. The Ottoman Empire capitulated in October after British Empire forces captured Damascus and Aleppo. Austria-Hungary, its empire fragmenting as constituent nationalities declared independence, signed armistice on November 3 after Italian forces won the Battle of Vittorio Veneto. Germany stood alone, its army falling back but still fighting, its home front crumbling under blockade. Food riots spread through German cities. The Kaiser's government lost authority. Naval mutiny at Kiel sparked revolution that spread across Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to neutral Netherlands. A republic was proclaimed. The new government sought armistice. The armistice ending the war was signed at dawn on November 11, 1918, in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne. At 11 o'clock that morning, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns fell silent across the Western Front. Soldiers in trenches didn't know how to respond. Some cheered. Others wept. Many simply sat in stunned silence, unable to comprehend that they had survived. In cities across the Allied nations, crowds gathered spontaneously, celebrating with wild abandon. Church bells rang. People danced in streets. but the celebration was tinged with exhaustion and grief. The war had killed approximately 20 million people and wounded 21 million more. Its economic cost approached $200 billion. The true reckoning would take generations. Entire families were erased from history, their lines ending in mud of Flanders or Verdun or Gallipoli. Villages in France lost every young man. Britain's aristocracy, whose sons had volunteered for officer positions, suffered disproportionate losses. The lost generation, who might have led in peace. Russia descended into civil war that would kill millions more. Austria-Hungary dissolved into successor states. The Ottoman Empire was partitioned, arbitrary borders drawn across Middle East creating conflicts that persist today. Germany, defeated but not occupied, nursed grievances about the war's outcome, believing itself betrayed rather than beaten. A dangerous mythology that would poison the peace. The Paris Peace Conference opened in January 1919, bringing together representatives of 32 nations to forge peace terms. But real decisions were made by the Council of Four. American President Woodrow Wilson, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George, French Premier Georges Clemenceau, and Italian Prime Minister Vittorio Orlando. They met in closed sessions, redrawing maps, creating nations, assigning blame. Wilson arrived with his 14 points, calling for fair peace based on self-determination and collective security through a League of Nations. Clemenceau wanted Germany crushed, stripped of military power, burdened with reparations that would prevent recovery. Lloyd George occupied middle ground, seeking balance between justice and vindictiveness. Italy wanted territorial gains. Japan wanted recognition as great power. The Treaty of Versailles, signed June 28, 1919, in the Hall of Mirrors where Germany had proclaimed empire 48 years earlier, imposed harsh terms. Germany lost territories in Europe and all overseas colonies. The German military was restricted to 100,000 men with no tanks, aircraft, or submarines. Germany was forbidden to unite with Austria. And critically, Article 231, the War Guilt Clause, assigned Germany sole responsibility for causing the war and demanded reparations to be determined later. Germany signed under protest. German representatives called the treaty a dictated peace, imposed by victors on vanquished, violating Wilson's promise of fair settlement. The treaty created resentments that would fester, providing fertile ground for extremism. Other treaties followed, dissolving Austria-Hungary into Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, with territories ceded to Poland, Romania, and Italy. The Ottoman Empire signed the Treaty of Sèvres, losing all Arab territories and most of its remaining land in Europe, though Turkish nationalists under Mustafa Kemal would fight successfully to renegotiate terms. New nations emerged, Poland, reconstituted after more than a century, stretching from the Baltic to the Carpathians, Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, multinational states that would prove unstable, the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Wilson's principle of self-determination was applied selectively, creating nations whose borders often ignored ethnic realities, planting seeds of future conflicts. The League of Nations, Wilson's dream of an international organization to prevent future wars, was established but fatally weakened when the U.S. Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, keeping America out of the League. Without American participation and enforcement, the League lacked power to compel compliance. Soviet Russia was excluded. Germany was initially excluded. The League became a forum for discussion rather than an effective peacekeeping body. When aggressor nations later violated its principles, the League could only condemn, not act. The organization's failure to prevent World War II would vindicate skeptics who argued that peace requires more than good intentions. It requires power and willingness to use that power against those who threaten international order. The human cost of the war extended beyond death tolls. Millions of veterans returned home bearing physical and psychological wounds. Men who had lost limbs struggled to find employment and dignity in societies ill-equipped to support them. Shell shock, what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, afflicted countless veterans, causing nightmares, tremors, emotional numbness, violent outbursts. Medical understanding was primitive. Treatment often consisted of dismissing symptoms as cowardice or weakness. Veterans suffered in silence, unable to communicate experiences that civilians could not comprehend. The war had created a generation gap not of years but of experience, dividing those who had served from those who had not, creating mutual incomprehension that would never fully heal. The war transformed women's roles across participating nations. With men at the front, women worked in munitions factories, drove ambulances, served as nurses near front lines, operated farms and businesses, filled clerical positions, and performed countless jobs previously reserved for men. They proved capable in all roles. After the war, attempts to force women back into pre-war domesticity faced resistance. Women had tasted independence and financial self-sufficiency. Suffrage movements, active before the war, gained momentum. Britain granted voting rights to women over 30 in 1918, extending to all women over 21 in 1928. The United States ratified the 19th Amendment in 1920. Other nations followed at varying pace. The war had accelerated social changes already underway, making return to old patterns impossible. Economically, the war shattered the international system that had existed before 1914. European nations that had been creditors became debtors, owing vast sums to the United States. Germany's economy collapsed under reparations burden and inflation. France struggled to rebuild devastated regions. Britain's financial dominance ended, replaced by American economic supremacy. The gold standard, suspended during the war, was not fully restored. Trade patterns disrupted by war blockades never recovered. The economic instability contributed to the Great Depression beginning in 1929, which in turn contributed to political extremism. The war's economic consequences proved almost as destructive as its military consequences, creating conditions where democracy struggled and authoritarian movements flourished. Culturally, the war destroyed the optimistic belief in progress that had characterized the 19th century. Before 1914, Western civilization believed it was ascending toward enlightenment, that science and reason would solve problems, that material prosperity and education would gradually eliminate conflict. The war revealed that progress could amplify destruction, that educated nations could descend into barbarism, that civilization was fragile veneer over deeper darkness. Writers, artists, and intellectuals struggled to process the war's meaning. The Lost Generation, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Remarque, Sassoon, Owen, produced literature exploring disillusionment and trauma. Dada and Surrealism rejected traditional art forms. The modernist movement emerged from wreckage of Victorian certainties, expressing fragmentation and alienation. Militarily, the war demonstrated that defensive technologies, machine guns, barbed wire, trenches, had temporarily gained advantage over offensive capabilities, creating stalemate. Tanks and aircraft eventually restored mobility, but not during the war itself. The conflict validated firepower over elan, preparation over improvisation, industrial capacity over individual courage. The romantic conception of war as glorious adventure died in the trenches. Military theorists studying the war drew contradictory lessons. Some emphasized offense and mobility. Others stressed defensive fortifications. France built the Maginot Line, an elaborate defensive system that would prove irrelevant in World War II. Germany developed blitzkrieg tactics combining tanks, aircraft, and mechanized infantry. The lessons of one war shaped preparations for the next, often incorrectly. The war's geopolitical consequences created the world we still inhabit. It destroyed four empires: German, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and Ottoman, redrawing maps across Europe and the Middle East. It elevated the United States to superpower status while leaving America unsure whether to embrace or reject global leadership. It brought communism to power in Russia, establishing a rival ideology that would shape the 20th century. It left Germany bitter and impoverished, creating conditions for Nazi rise. It carved artificial nations from Ottoman territories in the Middle East, ignoring ethnic and religious divisions, establishing conflicts still unresolved. The Second World War emerged directly from the First. The Cold War emerged from both. We are still living in the long shadow of 1914. Technologically, the war accelerated developments in aviation, medicine, communications, and chemistry. Aircraft evolved from novelties to essential military tools, establishing foundations for civil aviation. Medical advances in treating wounds, performing surgeries, and preventing infection saved countless lives during the war and benefited civilian medicine afterward. Radio communication became critical for coordinating operations. Chemical industries that produced poison gas also produced fertilizers and pharmaceuticals. The war demonstrated that national survival required industrial and scientific capability, leading governments to invest in research and development. Science mobilized for war would later be mobilized for peacetime progress. The relationship between government, military, industry, and academia established during the war became permanent. The question of why the war occurred has haunted historians for over a century. Was it caused by militarism, by alliance systems that turned local conflicts into global conflagrations, by imperial rivalries, by nationalism, by failures of diplomacy? Was Germany primarily responsible, as the Treaty of Versailles declared, or did all great powers share blame? Perhaps the war had no single cause but resulted from complex interactions of long-term trends and short-term decisions, from structural factors that made war possible and contingent factors that made it actual. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand was the spark, but the tinder had been accumulating for decades. Understanding the war's causes might help prevent future conflicts, or might reveal that such catastrophes emerge from dynamics beyond human control or comprehension. The war that contemporaries called the Great War was later renamed World War I, acknowledging that the conflicts of 1914 to 1918 had not ended but merely paused. The peace settlement left grievances that would erupt into renewed violence within 20 years. Germany sought revenge and restoration. Italy felt cheated of promised territories. Japan felt disrespected by Western powers. Colonial peoples who had fought for empires expected freedom, found themselves still subjects, and learned lessons about armed resistance. The war destroyed the old order but failed to create a stable new order. It was the catastrophe that made all subsequent catastrophes possible. Understanding its history is not merely academic exercise but essential for comprehending the modern world and perhaps avoiding repeating its mistakes. In cemeteries across Europe and beyond, rows of white headstones stretch toward horizons, marking graves of those who died in battles whose names are now half forgotten. Thiepval Memorial in France bears names of 72,000 British and South African soldiers with no known grave, lost in the Somme mud. The Menin Gate at Ypres records 54,000 Commonwealth soldiers missing in that sector. Douaumont Ossuary at Verdun contains remains of 130,000 unidentified French and German soldiers. At Arlington National Cemetery, the tomb of the unknown soldier holds remains of an American soldier who died in France. These memorials testify to the war's scale and waste, to lives abbreviated, potential unrealized, families shattered. They ask visitors to remember, to honor sacrifice, and perhaps to question whether any cause justified such cost. The war produced unexpected moments of humanity amid inhumanity. On Christmas 1914, along portions of the Western Front, soldiers from opposing sides spontaneously emerged from trenches, met in no man's land, exchanged gifts, sang carols, and played football. Officers on both sides were horrified by this fraternization and ensured it never recurred. But for one day, soldiers remembered they were men before they were enemies, that their true enemies might be those who sent them to die rather than those shooting at them. The Christmas truce became legend, a reminder that even in war's midst, human decency could surface. It suggests that wars are sustained not by soldiers' hatred of enemies, but by their loyalty to comrades and willingness to endure for causes they might not fully understand. Disease proved as deadly as combat. The Spanish flu pandemic, emerging in 1918, killed more people than the war itself. Estimates range from 50 to 100 million deaths worldwide. The war contributed to the pandemic's spread and severity. Troop movements carried the virus across continents. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Overcrowding in military camps, hospitals, and cities facilitated transmission. The flu struck young adults hardest, the same demographic already devastated by war. Some communities lost entire age cohorts to war and disease combined. The pandemic arrived as the war ended, compounding suffering, complicating demobilization, adding loss upon loss. It seemed as if the world, having survived 4 years of warfare, now faced divine punishment. The pandemic finally ran its course in 1920, leaving another legacy of mass graves and mourning. The Russian Revolution and subsequent civil war emerged directly from the war's pressures. Imperial Russia's collapse removed it from the war but plunged Russia into civil conflict between Reds and Whites, communists and monarchists, that killed millions through combat, disease, and famine. Foreign powers intervened half-heartedly, sending troops to support white forces, accomplishing little except convincing Bolsheviks that capitalist nations would always seek to destroy communism. The Civil War radicalized the Bolshevik government, establishing precedents for totalitarian control, secret police terror, and economic centralization that would characterize Soviet communism. Lenin died in 1924. Stalin succeeded him and implemented policies even more brutal. The revolution that promised liberation produced dictatorship. The war had birthed not only new nations but new ideologies, communism and fascism, that would contest liberal democracy throughout the 20th century. The war's literature provides perhaps the most powerful testimony to its nature. Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front depicted German soldiers' experiences with haunting realism, showing how war destroyed a generation psychologically before killing them physically. Ernst Junger's Storm of Steel offered unflinching account of combat from nationalist perspective, finding meaning in martial valor. Siegfried Sassoon's poems excoriated commanders who sent men to die while remaining safe behind lines. Wilfred Owen wrote, Dulce et decorum est, mocking the old lie that it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country, describing gas attack victims drowning in green light. These works, and hundreds of others, attempted to communicate war's reality to those who had not experienced it, to preserve memory before survivors died, to warn future generations. Photography and film documented the war, creating visual archive that previous conflicts lacked. Official photographers captured images of trenches, battlefields, destroyed towns, wounded soldiers. Propaganda films portrayed heroic actions and enemy atrocities. Some footage was staged, but much was authentic, showing war's reality with unprecedented immediacy. The images shocked civilians who saw them in newsreels. A photograph could communicate what words could not: the mud, the destruction, the exhaustion visible in soldiers' faces. After the war, these images became historical record, allowing later generations to see what their predecessors experienced. The war was the first conflict comprehensively photographed, making it impossible for later societies to romanticize based on paintings and descriptions that had sanitized earlier wars. Animals served in the war in vast numbers. Horses transported men and supplies, suffering in mud and shell fire. Millions died. Mules proved more reliable, stubbornly continuing when horses panicked. Dogs carried messages, located wounded soldiers, and provided companionship. Pigeons flew through artillery barges to deliver urgent communications when other methods failed. One pigeon named Sher Ami saved a trapped American battalion by delivering a message despite being shot through the breast. Cats and dogs controlled rats in trenches. Canaries detected poison gas. Soldiers formed attachments to animals, finding in them comfort and normalcy absent from human interactions. The animals had no understanding of the conflict's causes, no ideology, no nationalism, only loyalty, suffering, and service to humans who had bred them for war. The war's aftermath saw spiritual crises across Western civilization. Churches had blessed armies on both sides, praying for victory, assuring soldiers that God supported their cause. When the war produced only destruction, many questioned whether God existed or, if existing, whether he cared about human affairs. The war's irrationality and waste seemed to demonstrate absence of divine plan or meaning. Atheism and agnosticism gained adherents. Religious leaders struggled to explain why God permitted such suffering. Some argued the war was divine punishment for sin. Others suggested God suffered alongside humanity. Still others abandoned theological explanations, acknowledging mystery beyond human understanding. The war didn't destroy religion, but it damaged religious certainty and authority, contributing to secularization that would characterize modern Western societies. Memorialization took various forms across nations. France created Elissoir de Douaumont at Verdun, a massive structure containing remains of unidentified soldiers, and preserved sections of battlefield as memorial landscapes. Britain established the Imperial War Graves Commission, creating uniform cemeteries where soldiers of all ranks lie side by side, each headstone identical regardless of the deceased's status in life. A radical egalitarianism in death. Germany initially focused on mourning rather than glorifying, creating Totenbergen, castles of the dead, and somber memorials. Local communities erected monuments listing names of residents who died, often the town's young men in disproportionate numbers. These memorials served multiple purposes: honoring sacrifice, providing focus for grief, warning future generations, asserting national narratives about the war's meaning and lessons. The war's poets, many of whom died in combat, left verse that captured the war's essence more effectively than prose histories. Rupert Brooke wrote idealistic early poems like The Soldier, envisioning death in foreign fields as creating eternal English soil. He died in 1915 before experiencing trench warfare's reality. Wilfred Owen, writing later, described the old lie of glory, portraying soldiers as bent, diseased, haunted. He was killed 1 week before the armistice. Isaac Rosenberg wrote while serving, sending poems from the trenches, killed in 1918. Their works preserve the war's emotional reality: the initial patriotism, the gradual disillusionment, the horror, the endurance, the rage at those responsible. Poetry could compress experience into images that resonated. Poppies in Flanders fields, soldiers as cattle, gas-blinded faces like devils. The war's tactical lessons were studied obsessively by military professionals preparing for future conflicts. Some emphasized the defense's dominance, believing fortifications could render attacks suicidal. The French built the Maginot Line embodying this philosophy. Others concluded that offensive spirit, combined with new technologies, could restore mobility. German theorists developed concepts for combined arms operations using tanks, aircraft, and motorized infantry operating independently, bypassing resistance. British theorists like Liddell Hart advocated indirect approach, attacking weakly defended sectors and exploiting success. Soviet theorists developed deep battle concepts using successive echelons. American doctrine emphasized material superiority and firepower. Each nation interpreted the war through its own experiences and biases, drawing lessons that shaped their doctrines and preparations, for better or worse. The League of Nations failures in the 1930s demonstrated that the war's lessons had not prevented renewed aggression. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, the League condemned but could not compel withdrawal. When Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, the League imposed limited sanctions that proved ineffective. When Germany remilitarized the Rhineland in 1936, violating Versailles Treaty terms, the League did nothing. The organization revealed itself as toothless, unable to enforce its principles against determined aggressor nations. The failure stemmed partly from absence of American participation and partly from League members' unwillingness to risk another war to uphold collective security. The world had learned from 1914 that wars could spiral out of control, but it had not learned how to prevent them without credible threats of force. Reparations poisoned international relations for years. Germany made initial payments but soon claimed inability to continue. France occupied the Ruhr industrial region in 1923 to force compliance. German workers responded with passive resistance. Germany printed money to support striking workers, producing hyperinflation that destroyed savings and middle-class wealth. A wheelbarrow of marks couldn't buy a loaf of bread. The crisis subsided when international negotiations restructured debt, but damage was done. German resentment deepened. The myth spread that Germany had been stabbed in the back, not defeated militarily but betrayed by politicians who signed armistice. This narrative, historically inaccurate but politically powerful, would fuel Nazi rise. The reparations issue demonstrated that peace requires not just ending war but addressing war's causes and consequences justly. The war's colonial dimensions are often overlooked in European-focused narratives. Colonial troops fought on all fronts: Indian soldiers in France and Mesopotamia, African troops in France and East Africa, Chinese laborers in France, Caribbean soldiers in various theaters. These soldiers served empires that denied them basic rights at home. They expected their service would earn recognition, perhaps autonomy or independence. Instead, colonial rule continued largely unchanged. This betrayal radicalized independence movements. Leaders like Gandhi in India and Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam learned that empires would not voluntarily grant freedom. It must be taken. The seeds of decolonization, which would dismantle European empires after World War II, were planted during and immediately after World War I. The war globalized in ways beyond military campaigns. The war transformed aviation from novelty to essential military and eventually commercial technology. In 1914, aircraft were fragile scouts. By 1918, specialized fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance planes operated in coordinated air forces. After the war, demobilized pilots sought employment flying mail, passengers, and cargo. Airlines emerged, connecting cities and eventually continents. Aircraft design improved rapidly. Metal construction replaced wood and fabric. Engines became more powerful and reliable. Navigation instruments developed. The industry established during the war provided foundation for commercial aviation's explosive growth. Within decades, air travel became routine, shrinking the world, making global commerce and tourism accessible to millions. The war, for all its horrors, accelerated technological progress that reshaped peacetime society in beneficial ways. The war's scientific legacy includes advances in medicine, chemistry, and physics. Surgeons developed reconstructive techniques treating facial injuries that would have been fatal or permanently disfiguring previously. Blood transfusion became standardized, saving countless lives. Understanding of infection and sterilization improved. Chemical warfare research advanced chemistry generally. Physics benefited from work on ballistics, optics, and acoustics. The war demonstrated that organized scientific research could produce rapid practical advances, establishing models for peacetime research institutions. After the war, governments and industries invested in research and development, creating networks of laboratories and universities that would drive innovation through the 20th century. The war taught that science was not merely intellectual pursuit but strategic resource essential for national power and prosperity. The United States emerged from the war as the world's dominant economic power, creditor to exhausted European nations, possessor of vast industrial capacity, energized by victory. American culture began its global spread: jazz music, Hollywood films, consumer goods. The dollar challenged the pound sterling as international reserve currency. Wall Street rivaled London as financial center. But Americans remained ambivalent about global leadership. Senate rejection of the Versailles Treaty and League membership reflected isolationist sentiment, desire to return to pre-war normalcy. This tension between power and responsibility would characterize American foreign policy through the interwar period. The U.S. had resources to shape global order but lacked will to commit those resources, creating vacuum that aggressive powers would exploit. The war's poets wrote not only of combat but of home front disconnection. Civilians could not comprehend what soldiers experienced. Soldiers returning on leave found they could not explain, that attempts to communicate produced incomprehension or horror. The gap between those who served and those who didn't became unbridgeable. Siegfried Sassoon wrote bitterly of comfortable civilians supporting the war from safety, of politicians mouthing platitudes about sacrifice. This alienation persisted after the war. Veterans felt that their suffering had purchased nothing valuable, that civilian society had moved on while they remained trapped in memories. The psychological wounds proved more persistent than physical ones, haunting survivors for decades. Many never spoke of their experiences, carrying them silently to graves, leaving families to wonder what nightmares visited their fathers and grandfathers. The Middle East's modern conflicts trace directly to decisions made during and after World War I. The British promised Arab leaders independence in exchange for revolting against Ottoman rule, promises embodied in correspondence with Sharif Hussein of Mecca. Simultaneously, Britain promised Jewish leaders support for a homeland in Palestine through the Balfour Declaration. And secretly, Britain and France divided Ottoman territories between them through the Sykes-Picot Agreement. These contradictory promises created conflicts still unresolved. After the war, Britain and France established mandates over former Ottoman territories, drawing borders that ignored ethnic and religious divisions. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine were created as political entities, their boundaries determined by imperial interests rather than local realities. These artificial states struggled to develop cohesive national identities. The Armenian genocide, occurring during the war, marked one of the 20th century's first systematic attempts to exterminate an entire people. Ottoman authorities, fearing Armenian collaboration with Russian enemies, ordered deportation of Armenian populations from eastern Anatolia to Syrian deserts. The deportations became death marches. Conservative estimates suggest 800,000 to 1.2 million Armenians died through massacre, starvation, and exposure. Survivors scattered across the world as refugees. Turkey's subsequent denial of genocide created lasting bitterness. The genocide demonstrated that modern states possessed capacity and will to commit atrocities on unprecedented scales. It foreshadowed the Holocaust and other genocides that would scar the 20th century. The international community's failure to respond effectively established precedents that would permit future atrocities. Women's suffrage movements gained momentum from women's war contributions, but progress varied by nation. Britain granted limited suffrage in 1918, extended in 1928. The United States ratified the 19th Amendment in 1920. Germany granted women's suffrage in 1918. France waited until 1944. The war accelerated changes already underway but didn't single-handedly cause women's emancipation. Many women were forced from wartime jobs when men returned, facing pressure to resume domestic roles. But the experience of independence and competence could not be erased. Women had proven capabilities in traditionally male spheres. The post-war generation of women, having seen their mother's generation work in factories and drive ambulances, possessed expanded sense of possibility. Social change occurred gradually, meeting resistance, but the direction was irreversible. The war's financial cost staggered imagination. Estimates exceed $200 billion in contemporary terms, trillions in current dollars. This figure includes direct military expenditures but not indirect costs like lost production, destroyed infrastructure, and human capital eliminated. The war consumed wealth accumulated over decades of industrial growth. Government debt soared. Inflation eroded savings. Economic disruption contributed to post-war instability. The gold standard, which had regulated international finance before 1914, could not be fully restored. Trade barriers erected during the war persisted. International economic cooperation broke down. These economic problems contributed to the Great Depression beginning in 1929. The Depression in turn contributed to political extremism and eventually to World War II. The economic consequences of the peace, as economist John Maynard Keynes warned, proved as destructive as the war itself. Monuments to the war were often simple and powerful. The cenotaph in London, designed by Edwin Lutyens, is an empty tomb, simple and elegant, representing all who died. It became focal point for Remembrance Day ceremonies held annually on November 11th. In Paris, the tomb of the unknown soldier lies beneath the Arc de Triomphe, guarded by eternal flame. In villages across Europe and beyond, war memorials list names of local men who died, often a shocking proportion of the community's young male population. These memorials served practical and spiritual functions. They provided focal points for mourning, connected individual grief to national loss, and preserved memory for future generations. They asked those who came after to remember, to honor, and to strive to prevent recurrence of such catastrophe. The war produced art that broke with tradition. Otto Dix's paintings depicted war's horror with brutal honesty. Mutilated soldiers, corpses, destruction, refusing to aestheticize or glorify. John Singer Sargent's Gast showed a line of blinded soldiers, hands on shoulders of the man ahead, being led from battlefield. The painting captured war's industrial scale and human cost. Kathy Kollwitz, who lost a son in the war, created prints and sculptures expressing maternal grief. These artists rejected romantic notions of war as noble or beautiful, instead depicting it as degrading and destructive. Their work challenged viewers to confront uncomfortable truths, to acknowledge what war actually entailed rather than what propaganda claimed. Art became witness, document, protest. The Russian Civil War, fought from 1917 to 1922, was in many ways more brutal than the World War itself. Reds fought whites, Bolsheviks against monarchists, nationalists, and moderate socialists. Both sides committed atrocities. The war devastated an already exhausted nation. Famine killed millions. Typhus epidemics swept through populations weakened by malnutrition. Agricultural production collapsed. Cities starved. The Bolsheviks implemented war communism, requisitioning grain from peasants, breeding resentment that would later explode. Foreign intervention complicated matters. British, French, American, and Japanese forces entered Russia supporting white forces but accomplished little. The intervention convinced Bolsheviks that capitalist nations would never accept communist state, fostering paranoia that characterized Soviet foreign policy for decades. The Civil War radicalized the revolution, establishing precedents for totalitarian control. The war's end did not bring immediate peace to many regions. Border conflicts erupted across Eastern Europe as new nations established territories. Poland fought Russia in 1919 to 1920, advancing deep into Ukraine before being pushed back and then counterattacking successfully. Greece invaded Anatolia in 1919 with Allied approval, seeking to realize territorial ambitions. Turkish nationalists under Mustafa Kemal organized resistance, eventually driving Greek forces out and renegotiating the peace settlement. Ireland's independence struggle intensified, leading to civil war. Fighting continued in various forms until 1923. The Armistice of November 1918 ended the Great War but inaugurated a period of smaller conflicts that would not be fully resolved for years. The war had unleashed forces that could not be easily contained or controlled. The influenza pandemic that struck during the war's final year killed more people than the war itself. Estimates range from 50 to 100 million deaths worldwide, 3 to 5% of global population. The disease struck young adults hardest, unlike typical influenza that primarily threatens the very young and old. Healthy people could be dead within days or even hours of first symptoms. The pandemic arrived in 3 waves, the second in fall 1918 being most deadly. It spread rapidly through military camps and troop transports, then into civilian populations. Medical science could offer no cure, no vaccine, no effective treatment. People wore masks, avoided crowds, closed schools and theaters. But the virus could not be stopped. It eventually ran its course, leaving another legacy of mass death, another layer of grief atop war's losses. Shell shock, the contemporary term for what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, afflicted hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Symptoms included tremors, nightmares, paralysis, mutism, violent outbursts, emotional numbness, and inability to function. Medical understanding was primitive. Some doctors believed shell shock resulted from physical concussion from nearby explosions. Others considered it psychological, though many viewed it as weakness or cowardice. Treatment ranged from rest to harsh discipline designed to shame soldiers into recovery. Many victims received no effective help and suffered for the rest of their lives. The war demonstrated that psychological wounds could be as debilitating as physical injuries, though societies were slow to acknowledge this reality. Recognition and treatment of combat trauma would improve only gradually over subsequent decades. The war's artists and writers attempted to process experiences that exceeded language's capacity. Poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon wrote verse that captured horror and pity. Novelists like Henri Barbusse and Ford Madox Ford created fiction exploring consciousness under extreme stress. Painters like Paul Nash depicted landscapes transformed into alien nightmares. But perhaps the most honest acknowledgement came from those who admitted they could not communicate what they had experienced, that words and images necessarily failed, that the war existed in a realm beyond civilian comprehension. Some survivors never spoke of their service. Others spoke obsessively, compulsively, needing to tell but knowing they could not be understood. This failure of communication created isolation that deepened survivors' trauma, leaving them trapped with memories they could neither express nor forget. The war demonstrated limitations of military power in achieving political objectives. Germany won spectacular victories in the east, conquering vast territories, yet could not translate military success into favorable peace. Britain maintained naval supremacy but could not prevent enemy submarine campaigns from nearly succeeding. France defended national territory but at such cost that victory felt Pyrrhic. Austria-Hungary defeated Serbia yet began disintegrating internally. The Ottoman Empire fought effectively in some theaters yet still collapsed. Military victory did not guarantee political success. The war revealed that in modern conflicts, winning battles was insufficient. Nations must also maintain domestic morale, industrial production, international support, and clear political objectives. Clausewitz's dictum that war was politics by other means proved more relevant than ever. Military means disconnected from achievable political ends produced only waste. The Paris Peace Conference represented an attempt to rebuild international order on new foundations of self-determination, collective security, and international law. Partially succeeded and partially failed. New nations emerged from collapsed empires. The League of Nations was established. International institutions for cooperation were created. But the peace settlement also sowed seeds of future conflict through harsh terms imposed on defeated powers, through boundaries that ignored ethnic realities, through broken promises to colonial peoples who had fought for the Allies. The peacemakers faced impossible tasks, satisfying victors' demands while creating lasting peace, applying idealistic principles while managing practical political pressures, reconstructing world order while nations remained exhausted and divided. Perhaps no settlement could have succeeded completely, but the settlement actually satisfied almost no one and pleased none. Technology developed for war found peacetime applications. Aircraft became commercial transport. Radio went from military communication to entertainment and news broadcasting. Advances in medicine developed to treat wounded soldiers benefited civilian healthcare. Industrial production techniques refined to mass-produce weapons and munitions transformed manufacturing. Chemistry, metallurgy, and engineering all advanced through war-driven research. This pattern, war-driving technological innovation that then benefits peace, became characteristic of the 20th century. It raised moral questions. Did progress justify war's cost? Could similar advances occur without war's stimulus? Was there something wrong with societies that required mass violence to spur innovation? These questions remain unresolved, troubling those who recognize that much of modern life's comfort emerges indirectly from past conflicts. The war's commemoration evolved over decades as direct memory faded and new generations interpreted events through different lenses. Initially, memorialization emphasized sacrifice and national glory. Later, as pacifist sentiments grew during the 1920s and 1930s, commemoration stressed war's futility and waste, emphasizing the never-again message. After World War II demonstrated that the Great War had indeed been merely a first installment, commemoration became more complex, acknowledging heroism while questioning purposes. Recent decades have seen efforts to recover individual stories from mass casualty statistics, to honor previously marginalized participants like colonial troops and women, to understand the war in global rather than purely European terms. Memory is never static. Each generation remembers the past differently, finding in historical events meanings relevant to present concerns. The question of whether the war was inevitable or could have been prevented through different decisions remains debated. Some historians see the war as a result of deep structural factors, militarism, alliance systems, imperial rivalries, that made conflict nearly inevitable by 1914. Others emphasize contingency, arguing that different decisions during the July crisis could have localized the conflict or prevented it entirely. The debate matters because it relates to broader questions about human agency and historical causation. If the war was inevitable, then leaders bore limited responsibility and similar catastrophes might be unavoidable in future. If the war resulted from preventable errors, then careful diplomacy and wise leadership might prevent similar disasters. Perhaps the truth combines both perspectives. Structural factors made war possible, but human decisions made it actual. The lesson might be that we must address both structures and decisions to build lasting peace. The war's literature includes works that found beauty or meaning amid horror. Ernst Junger's Storm of Steel, described combat with aesthetic appreciation, portraying battle as elemental experience that revealed truth unavailable in ordinary life. Robert Graves' Goodbye to All That combined horror with dark humor. These works complicated simple narratives of war's futility. They suggested that soldiers found meaning in comradeship, duty, endurance, and occasionally in combat itself, however terrible. This complicated recognition that war is simultaneously horrible and can provide intense experiences of meaning troubles those who wish to portray war as simply wasteful. Perhaps it reflects something uncomfortable about human nature, our capacity to find fulfillment even in destructive contexts. Or perhaps it testifies to humans' resilience, our ability to create meaning even when surrounded by meaninglessness. The war's naval campaigns included not only fleet battles and submarine warfare but also blockades that proved strategically decisive. Britain's blockade of Germany prevented imports of food and raw materials, contributing to civilian starvation and economic collapse. By war's end, German civilians were subsisting on turnips and ersatz coffee. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, contributing to disease. The blockade continued after the armistice until the peace treaty was signed, prolonging suffering. An estimated hundreds of thousands of German civilians died from malnutrition-related causes. The blockade demonstrated that modern wars targeted entire societies, not just armed forces. Total war meant mobilizing entire economies, which meant those economies became legitimate targets. The distinction between combatants and civilians, never absolute, eroded further. This pattern would intensify in World War II with strategic bombing campaigns deliberately targeting civilian morale. Veterans organizations formed after the war to provide mutual support and advocate for benefits. In Britain, the British Legion assisted disabled veterans and their families, organized Poppy Day fundraising, and lobbied government. In America, the American Legion served similar functions. In Germany, veterans groups varied politically. Some supported the Weimar Republic, others joined right-wing paramilitary groups that would provide recruits for Nazi stormtroopers. Veterans possessed shared experiences that separated them from civilians. Their organizations provided community of understanding, places where former soldiers could speak without explanation. But veterans were not politically uniform. Some became pacifists, determined to prevent future wars. Others embraced militarism, believing the war had been glorious or that Germany had been betrayed. Veterans' political orientation shaped interwar politics significantly, contributing to both peace movements and fascist movements. The war's medical challenges drove innovation in treatment and organization. The scale of casualties overwhelmed existing medical systems. Field hospitals had to be established near front lines. Triage systems prioritized treatment based on survival likelihood. Ambulance services transported wounded from battlefield to aid stations to hospitals. Blood transfusion became routine. Prosthetics improved for amputees. Facial reconstruction surgery developed to treat horrific wounds. Psychological treatment for shell shock, however inadequate, at least recognized that combat could produce mental injury. Nursing expanded as profession, with women serving in unprecedented numbers near combat zones. These advances benefited military and civilian medicine. The war demonstrated that organized medical systems could save lives under extreme conditions, establishing models that influenced healthcare delivery long after. But it also revealed limitations. Some wounds and traumas remained beyond medicine's power to heal. Propaganda during the war reached levels of sophistication and pervasiveness previously unknown. Governments established agencies to control information and shape public opinion. Atrocity stories, often exaggerated or fabricated, portrayed enemies as barbarians. Posters encouraged enlistment, war bond purchases, and food conservation. Films depicted heroic allies and brutal enemies. Newspapers printed government-approved narratives while suppressing dissenting voices. Censorship prevented publication of information that might undermine morale. This propaganda was effective. It maintained public support for years despite horrific casualties. But after the war, when exaggerations became known, populations grew cynical about official information. This cynicism weakened government's credibility during the 1920s and 1930s, contributing to difficulty in mobilizing against later fascist threats. The war demonstrated propaganda's power but also its limits and dangers. Societies that believed lies during the war struggled to believe truth afterward. The war's impact on art movements was profound. Dada emerged from neutral Switzerland during the war, a nihilistic rejection of reason, tradition, and civilization that had produced such catastrophe. Dadaists created nonsense poetry, absurd performances, and anti-art that questioned art's purpose and meaning. Surrealism followed, exploring irrationality, dreams, and unconscious, seeking truth beneath rational consciousness that had proven so inadequate. Expressionism depicted emotional reality rather than external appearance, using distorted forms and violent colors to convey inner experience. These movements rejected 19th-century realism and idealism, seeking new forms appropriate to worlds shattered by war. They influenced architecture, design, literature, and music. Modernism, in its various forms, emerged from recognition that old certainties had collapsed, that new artistic languages were needed for new realities. The war destroyed not just political orders but aesthetic orders, demanding reinvention. The war's conclusion brought neither justice nor reconciliation. Germany felt betrayed, believing the armistice had promised lenient peace based on Wilson's 14 points. France felt insufficiently secured against future German aggression. Italy felt cheated of promised territories. Colonial peoples felt deceived by broken promises of independence. The peace settlement satisfied no one, creating resentments that would fester and eventually explode. The war that was supposed to end all wars instead made future wars more likely. Its inconclusive nature, Germany defeated but not occupied, punished but not destroyed, created unstable equilibrium. The settlement was harsh enough to breed resentment but not harsh enough to prevent German recovery. It was idealistic in rhetoric but cynical in practice. Perhaps no settlement could have succeeded, but the one achieved virtually guaranteed that within a generation, the world would again descend into warfare. The war's social impact included breakdown of class barriers, at least temporarily. Officers and enlisted men, aristocrats and workers, served together in trenches, their peacetime status irrelevant amid shells and gas. Shared suffering created solidarity across class lines. After the war, deference to traditional elites weakened. Aristocrats who had sent men to die lost moral authority. The war had proven that birth did not guarantee competence or wisdom. Demands grew for political representation and economic justice for working classes who had done the fighting. Socialist and communist movements gained strength. Labor unions grew. Universal suffrage expanded. The old hierarchies never fully recovered. The war accelerated social leveling that would characterize 20th-century democracies, though elites resisted and sometimes successfully reasserted privilege. The war demonstrated that modern conflicts required mass participation, which gave masses political leverage they had previously lacked. The aerial aces of World War I became celebrities, their exploits followed by publics hungry for heroes amid industrial slaughter. Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, achieved 80 confirmed victories before being killed in April 1918. René Fonck of France recorded 75 victories and survived the war. Edward Manick of Britain achieved 73 victories before being shot down in July 1918. Billy Bishop of Canada claimed 72 victories and survived. These men fought individual duels above the trenches, their colorfully painted aircraft distinctive against sky. They represented last vestige of personal combat, of warrior honor, in war increasingly dominated by impersonal technology. Their celebrity testified to public's need for heroes, for individuals who mattered in conflict where most were anonymous. But romanticizing aces obscured reality. Most pilots died quickly, their service brief and brutal, their chances of survival minimal. The war's impact on music ranged from patriotic songs to profound compositions grappling with trauma and loss. Marching songs sustained morale. Folk songs emerged from trenches, often expressing irony and dark humor. Classical composers responded variously, some with patriotic works, others with music expressing grief and horror. Maurice Ravel wrote Le Tombeau de Couperin, dedicating each movement to a friend killed in the war. Benjamin Britten's War Requiem, composed decades later, combined Latin Mass with Wilfred Owen's poetry. Jazz, emerging from African-American communities in America, became soundtrack of post-war era, its syncopation and improvisation seeming appropriate to disordered world. The war changed what music could express and how it functioned. Simple patriotic melodies proved inadequate. New forms emerged to express experiences that older forms could not contain. Music became witness to trauma that transcended words. The war's logistics proved as challenging as combat. Feeding, clothing, arming, and transporting millions of men required unprecedented organization. Railroads carried troops and supplies to front. Trucks and wagons distributed material to units. Specialized services managed food, ammunition, fuel, horses, medical supplies. Quartermasters calculated requirements and organized procurement. Ports handled shipping. Repair depots maintained equipment. Communication networks carried orders and reports. This vast apparatus, mostly invisible to combatants, determined what was possible operationally. Offensives failed when logistics couldn't sustain them. Breakthroughs couldn't be exploited when supplies ran out. The saying arose that amateurs study tactics while professionals study logistics. The war demonstrated that modern warfare demanded not just bravery and tactical skill but organizational competence and industrial capacity. Victory went to nations that could mobilize and sustain mass armies over years, not to those with superior martial traditions. The war's aftermath saw waves of migration as people fled violence, starvation, and persecution. Russians fled civil war and Bolshevik revolution, creating exile communities across Europe and beyond. Armenians fled genocide, establishing diaspora communities. Greeks and Turks were exchanged between nations in massive population transfers. Jews fled pogroms in Eastern Europe. Germans were expelled from territories ceded to Poland and other nations. Millions became refugees, stateless persons, displaced people, categories that became common in 20th century. The post-war chaos created humanitarian crisis requiring international response. Organizations like the International Committee of the Red Cross and League of Nations High Commissioner for Refugees worked to assist displaced populations. But the problem exceeded available resources. The war had uprooted peoples on unprecedented scale, beginning demographic transformations that would continue throughout the century. The world learned that modern wars don't end when fighting stops but leave humanitarian crises requiring years or decades to resolve. The concept of war crimes emerged more clearly during and after this conflict. Germany's violation of Belgian neutrality was declared illegal, though not prosecuted. Submarine warfare against merchant vessels without warning violated established rules. Use of poison gas contravened pre-war agreements, though once used, all sides adopted it. Germany's execution of British nurse Edith Cavell for helping Allied prisoners escape generated outrage. The Armenian genocide, though not prosecuted, was documented and condemned. After the war, Allied leaders discussed prosecuting Kaiser Wilhelm II and other German leaders for war crimes, though this was ultimately abandoned. The Versailles Treaty included provisions for war crimes trials that were never fully implemented. But the war established precedent for holding individuals accountable for violations of war's laws and customs, a principle that would be developed further after World War II with Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals. The war's chemical warfare left legacy of injury and fear. Poison gas killed relatively few, perhaps 90,000 deaths, but injured over 1 million. Victims suffered damaged lungs, blindness, and psychological trauma. Mustard gas caused horrific blistering and could contaminate ground for weeks. Phosgene killed by flooding lungs with fluid. Chlorine caused immediate choking. Governments researched more deadly agents but thankfully did not deploy them before war's end. After the war, the 1925 Geneva Protocol prohibited chemical weapons use, though not development or stockpiling. The prohibition held largely during World War II, partly from fear of retaliation. But chemical weapons remained in arsenals as deterrent. Their use in World War I demonstrated that technological capability does not determine usage. Moral, legal, and practical considerations also matter. The taboo against chemical weapons, established partly through World War I's experience, remains largely effective, though violations occur and risk of chemical terrorism continues. The war's economic effects included shifts in global financial power from Europe to United States. Before the war, London was world's financial center, the pound sterling was dominant reserve currency, and Britain was world's largest creditor. The war reversed this. Britain borrowed heavily from America to finance war effort. After the war, Britain owed vast sums. America became creditor, New York rivaled London as financial center, and the dollar challenged sterling. This shift in economic power eventually translated into shift in political and military power, though America remained reluctant to assume global leadership role. The war demonstrated that economic and military power were interconnected, that nations could not sustain military efforts beyond economic capacity, that modern wars were won by economies as much as armies. This lesson influenced grand strategy for remainder of the century, with nations recognizing that economic strength formed foundation for military capability. The war produced unexpected technological spin-offs. Wristwatches became standard after officers found them more convenient than pocket watches in trenches. Stainless steel was developed for rifle barrels. Daylight saving time was implemented to conserve fuel for war production. Sanitary napkins were developed from materials used for wound dressings. Chemists synthesizing explosives developed processes later used for fertilizers and pharmaceuticals. Pilots' leather jackets became fashion items. Trench coats entered civilian wardrobes. These everyday items carried war's legacy into peacetime, invisible reminders of conflict that had transformed them from military necessities to consumer products. The war touched civilian life in countless subtle ways, its influence extending far beyond obvious impacts on politics and international relations. Even mundane objects carried historical weight, their origins in battlefield necessities forgotten by users in subsequent generations who inherited worlds shaped by war they could not remember. War memorials took diverse forms reflecting different national attitudes. Germany's memorials often emphasized mourning rather than victory, expressing grief for dead and sometimes questioning war's purpose. France erected monuments celebrating victory while honoring sacrifice. Britain's memorials listed names of dead from each community, emphasizing individual losses accumulated into national tragedy. America's memorials often incorporated classical architectural elements, connecting sacrifice to ancient traditions of republican virtue. These differences reflected varying narratives about war's meaning, as victorious crusade, as tragic waste, as noble sacrifice, as lesson about war's futility. Each nation constructed memory in ways that served current needs and values. Memorials were not just backward-looking but forward-looking, teaching lessons to future generations, asserting national identities, warning or inspiring. They demonstrated that history is always interpreted through present concerns, that memory is never merely preservation but active construction of meaning. The war accelerated women's entry into workforce but also provoked backlash. During the war, women worked in munitions factories, drove ambulances, operated farms, filled clerical positions, served as nurses. They demonstrated competence in roles previously reserved for men. But after armistice, most were dismissed to make positions available for returning soldiers. Governments and employers encouraged women to resume domestic roles. Propaganda that had celebrated women war workers now emphasized motherhood and homemaking as women's proper sphere. Yet the experience could not be erased. Women had tasted independence, earned wages, proven capabilities. The post-war generation of women possessed expanded aspirations. Though immediate post-war years saw conservative reaction, long-term trends toward women's equality continued. The war was one factor among many driving social change, accelerating some trends while temporarily reversing others. Social progress proved neither linear nor inevitable but advanced through complex patterns of change and resistance. The Christmas truce of 1914 became legendary but was never repeated. In subsequent years, military authorities took precautions to prevent fraternization, scheduling artillery barges for Christmas Day, rotating units to prevent soldiers from becoming familiar with opponents, punishing fraternization severely. The war could not be sustained if soldiers recognized common humanity with enemies. Military effectiveness required dehumanizing opponents, maintaining psychological distance. Propaganda served this purpose, portraying enemies as monsters. But soldiers who faced each other daily often developed complex attitudes. Recognizing enemies' courage, respecting their suffering, understanding they were trapped in same circumstances. Veterans' memoirs frequently express this complexity. Hatred for enemy leadership and system while acknowledging ordinary soldiers' shared humanity. This tension between official narratives demanding hatred and personal experience, revealing common humanity, created moral confusion that many veterans struggled to resolve, leaving them alienated from civilian society that demanded simple narratives. The peace conference created several international institutions intended to prevent future wars and manage international relations. The League of Nations was most prominent, but others included International Labor Organization, Permanent Court of International Justice, and various technical organizations managing communications, health, and economic cooperation. These institutions embodied hope that international cooperation could prevent conflicts, that reason and law could replace force in international relations. This hope proved premature. The League lacked enforcement mechanisms and suffered from major powers' absence. United States never joined, Soviet Union was excluded initially, Germany was excluded initially, Japan and Italy later withdrew. But the institutions established precedent for international governance. After World War II, they were revived in improved forms: United Nations, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, World Health Organization. The vision of managed international cooperation, though failing initially, eventually bore fruit. First World War's peace institutions were an unsuccessful attempt at something that would later succeed partially. The war's impact on European empires was profound and delayed. Immediately after the war, empires appeared stronger. Germany's colonies were distributed among victors. Ottoman territories became British and French mandates. Indian troops' loyalty seemed proven. But the war had weakened imperial powers economically and morally. Colonial subjects who had fought for empires expected reward, autonomy, or independence. When expectations were frustrated, independence movements radicalized. Gandhi in India shifted from supporting British war effort to leading non-cooperation campaigns. Vietnamese, Arab, and African nationalists concluded that imperial powers would not voluntarily grant freedom. The war demonstrated that empires could be defeated, that European powers were not invincible. World War II would complete process that World War I began, with most colonies gaining independence in post-war decades. The war thus marked beginning of end of European empires, though the end took decades to fully manifest and involved considerable violence. The war's veterans struggled with reintegration into civilian society. Jobs were scarce, economies disrupted, populations exhausted. Veterans competed with each other and with civilians for limited opportunities. Disabled veterans faced additional obstacles. Employers preferred hiring able-bodied workers. Social attitudes often stigmatized visible disabilities. Many veterans felt betrayed by governments and societies that had sent them to war, then failed to support them afterward. In Germany, this resentment fueled right-wing movements. In Britain and France, veterans' organizations lobbied for benefits with mixed success. In America, veterans marched on Washington demanding payment of promised bonuses, only to be dispersed by military force. The contrast between wartime rhetoric about heroes and post-war neglect embittered many veterans. Some turned to radical politics, communism, or fascism, seeking revolutionary solutions to societies they believed had failed them. Veterans' experiences shaped interwar politics significantly, often in destabilizing ways. The question of how to remember the war divided societies. Should memorials emphasize victory and glory, or loss and mourning? Should they celebrate sacrifice, or question war's purposes? Should they focus on national narratives, or universal human suffering? Different nations, communities, and families answered differently. Some memorials proclaimed, Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. Sweet and fitting it is to die for country. Others, influenced by anti-war sentiment, emphasized futility and waste. Some listed names without commentary, letting bare facts speak. These debates reflected deeper conflicts about war's meaning and about how societies should remember trauma. Should memory serve to justify suffering through claiming it served noble purpose? Or should memory serve to prevent repetition through emphasizing horror? Perhaps both approaches were necessary, honoring those who served while questioning systems that required such sacrifice. But reconciling these approaches proved difficult, and memory remained contested, political, meaningful. The war's naval blockade of Germany raised ethical and legal questions about starving civilian populations. International law allowed blockading military supplies, but food was ambiguous. Civilian populations needed food to survive, but food also sustained military forces. Britain's blockade prevented food imports to Germany, contributing to malnutrition that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The blockade continued after armistice until peace treaty was signed, prolonging suffering to compel German compliance with Allied demands. Germany protested the blockade's illegality and immorality. Allied powers defended it as legitimate warfare targeting enemy economy. The debate reflected broader questions about total war. If entire nations were mobilized for war, were entire populations legitimate targets? The blockade established precedent that would influence World War II, when strategic bombing deliberately targeted civilian morale. The distinction between combatants and non-combatants, always somewhat artificial, eroded further, with troubling implications for warfare's future conduct. The war's artillery barrages created soundscapes unlike anything previously experienced. Bombardments could be heard hundreds of miles away. The noise was physically painful, causing hearing damage even when shells landed nowhere near. Some soldiers lost hearing permanently. Others suffered from constant ringing in ears long after war ended. The psychological impact of continuous noise, the screaming of shells, the explosions, the machine gun chatter, added to combat stress. Silence became rare and precious. Some soldiers, returning home, could not tolerate quiet and sought noise. Others craved silence but could not escape internal noise of memory. The war demonstrated that trauma was not purely psychological or physical but involved all senses, that exposure to extreme sensory experiences could cause lasting damage. Modern understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder recognizes sensory components, how certain sounds or smells trigger memories and panic. The war provided early evidence for this phenomenon. The war's impact on language included introducing new words and changing meanings of existing words. Shell shock entered vocabulary. No man's land took on new resonance. Doughboy, Tommy, poilu became terms for American, British, and French soldiers, respectively. Going over the top meant leaving trenches to attack. Trench foot described foot disease from constant immersion in water. Ace meant pilot with multiple victories. Military slang reflected soldiers' experiences and attitudes, sardonic, profane, fatalistic. Some terms passed into general usage. The war also changed language's emotional register. Words like glory, honor, and sacrifice became complicated, their meanings questioned by those who had witnessed war's reality. Post-war literature often employed irony, using elevated language to describe sordid realities, exposing gap between official rhetoric and experienced truth. The war changed not just what people said but how they said it, marking shift from Victorian earnestness toward modernist skepticism and irony. The war's trenches became archaeological sites, preserving artifacts and remains. Many battlefields were cleared and returned to agriculture or development, but some areas were deemed too contaminated. Too many unexploded shells, too much barbed wire, too many bodies. These areas were designated as Zone Rouge in France, forbidden zones too dangerous for habitation or farming. Even today, farmers regularly uncover shells, grenades, and other ordnance. Unexploded munitions kill or injure several people yearly in former combat zones. Remains of soldiers are occasionally discovered and, when possible, identified through modern forensic techniques and reburied with military honors. The landscape itself bears scars. Shell craters still visible, trenches preserved as memorials, forests that never regrew properly. The war thus remains physically present a century later, the ground itself witnessing events that living memory has forgotten. History is not merely written in books but inscribed in earth. The war's medical treatment of psychological casualties evolved during conflict. Initially, shell shock was often treated as cowardice, with victims threatened with execution if they did not return to duty. Gradually, understanding improved. Military authorities recognized that even brave soldiers could break under extreme stress, that there were limits to human endurance. Treatment facilities were established behind lines, providing rest, food, quiet. Pioneering psychiatrists like W.W. Rivers developed talking therapies, encouraging soldiers to confront traumatic memories rather than suppressing them. But resources were limited, understanding incomplete. Many soldiers were returned to duty before fully recovered. Others were diagnosed with shell shock to excuse behaviors that military authorities wished to treat sympathetically despite violating regulations. The category became convenient fiction sometimes, genuine illness other times. The war forced recognition that minds could be wounded like bodies, establishing foundations for modern understanding of trauma, though much remained to be learned. The war's impact on religion included both strengthening and weakening faith. Some soldiers found comfort in religion, attending services when possible, carrying Bibles or prayer books, finding in faith resources for enduring horror. Chaplains ministered to troops, providing spiritual support and performing burial services. Many soldiers' letters home expressed religious sentiments, hoping to meet families again in heaven if killed. But others lost faith, unable to reconcile loving God with war's horrors. If God existed and was good, why did he permit such suffering? The theodicy problem, reconciling God's goodness with evil's existence, confronted millions personally. Some concluded God did not exist. Others maintained faith while abandoning specific theological claims, embracing vague spirituality. Still others compartmentalized, maintaining religious observance while acknowledging doubts. The war did not destroy religion, but it damaged religious certainty, contributing to secularization that characterized 20th century Western societies. Faith became choice rather than assumption for many. The war's photographers captured images that shaped public understanding. Official photographers documented military operations, providing images for newspapers and newsreels. Some images were staged or censored to avoid showing war's worst horrors or damaging morale. But even censored images conveyed war's scale and destruction. Endless trenches, devastated towns, long columns of prisoners, field hospitals. Unofficial photographs, taken by soldiers with personal cameras, captured informal moments and sometimes grimmer realities. After the war, these photographs became historical documents, preserving visual evidence of events that written accounts could not fully convey. Photographs gave faces to statistics, made abstract numbers concrete, allowed later generations to see what earlier generations experienced. They also raised questions about war photography's ethics. Was documenting suffering exploitation or witnessing? Did photographs that made war look glorious encourage future wars? Could images capture truth, or did they inevitably distort through framing and selection? These questions continue to trouble photojournalism today. The war's codebreakers contributed significantly to outcomes. British intelligence decrypted the Zimmermann telegram, German proposal for alliance with Mexico, exposing it to American authorities and public. The revelation damaged German-American relations and contributed to American entry into war. British Room 40 intercepted and decrypted German naval communications, providing intelligence that helped Royal Navy track German fleet movements. The French broke German army codes, providing tactical intelligence. Germans similarly broke Allied codes sometimes. Code-breaking demonstrated that information warfare mattered as much as kinetic warfare, that intelligence could influence outcomes dramatically. The cryptographic lessons learned during World War I influenced subsequent developments. World War II saw even more sophisticated code-breaking, with British decryption of German Enigma codes and American breaking of Japanese codes playing crucial roles. The World War I codebreakers pioneered techniques and established institutions that influenced intelligence services throughout 20th century. Their work remained classified for decades after war, their contributions unrecognized except by small circles of initiates. The war's impact on philosophy included undermining faith in reason and progress. 19th century philosophy had emphasized reason's power to understand reality and improve society. Hegel had portrayed history as rational progress. Utilitarians had believed that calculating greatest good for greatest number could guide policy. Positivists had claimed that scientific method could resolve all questions. The war challenged these assumptions. How could rational civilized nations create such catastrophe? How could science and technology serve destruction rather than improvement? How could educated people behave barbarously? Philosophers responded variously. Some, like Oswald Spengler, proclaimed Western civilization's decline. Others, like John Dewey, argued for reconstructing philosophy on more pragmatic foundations. Existentialists like Sartre and Camus explored meaninglessness and absurdity. Logical positivists retreated into narrow technical philosophy, abandoning grand metaphysical claims. The war did not create these philosophical movements but accelerated them, contributing to modernism's rejection of Victorian certainties. The war's end brought economic challenges as nations demobilized and converted from war production to peacetime economies. Millions of soldiers needed jobs. Factories producing munitions needed to shift to consumer goods. Government spending contracted. Inflation had eroded purchasing power during the war. These disruptions contributed to recessions in several nations during early 1920s. Germany's economy collapsed under reparations burden and hyperinflation. Britain struggled with unemployment and labor unrest. France rebuilt devastated regions while managing war debts. The United States experienced economic boom in the 1920s, partly from lending to Europe and producing goods European industries could not yet supply. But the boom was unstable, built on speculation and credit, ultimately collapsing into Great Depression. The war's economic consequences thus extended years beyond armistice, contributing to instability that would eventually produce conditions for renewed conflict. Economic historians debate whether different policies could have prevented these problems or whether war's economic dislocations inevitably produced prolonged difficulties. The war's treatment of conscientious objectors varied across nations. Britain allowed conscientious objection on religious or moral grounds but required alternative service. Those who refused any cooperation were imprisoned, sometimes harshly treated. Some died in prison. Others were assigned dangerous labor. France allowed no conscientious objection. All men of military age were required to serve. Those who refused faced execution or harsh imprisonment. Germany similarly allowed no conscientious objection. United States permitted conscientious objection based on religious affiliation with pacifist denominations like Quakers or Mennonites, but not secular ethical objection. Those recognized as conscientious objectors were assigned non-combatant roles or alternative service. Others were imprisoned. Treatment of conscientious objectors reflected society's attitudes toward individual conscience versus collective obligation. After the war, some societies granted amnesty to imprisoned objectors, recognizing their principled stance. Others maintained that refusing to serve had been betrayal deserving punishment. The debate about conscientious objection continues wherever conscription exists, balancing states' need for military manpower against individuals' rights to follow conscience. The war's propaganda posters became iconic images, recognizable long after conflict ended. Britain's Lord Kitchener pointing with caption, "Your country needs you," became famous. America's "I Want You, Uncle Sam" poster remains instantly recognizable. France's posters showed women and children endangered by German brutality. Germany's posters portrayed Russian barbarism threatening European civilization. These images used powerful visual rhetoric, direct gaze engaging viewer, simple bold designs, emotional appeals to duty, fear, and pride. They were effective in mobilizing populations, encouraging enlistment, selling war bonds, promoting industrial production. But after the war, they seemed manipulative and dishonest, contributing to public cynicism about government messaging. The posters remained culturally significant, frequently referenced or parodied in later contexts. They demonstrated propaganda's power while also illustrating its limits. Propaganda could mobilize populations initially but could not sustain support indefinitely if contradicted by reality. The gap between propaganda's promises and war's reality contributed to post-war disillusionment that shaped interwar cultures. The war's cavalry discovered themselves obsolete on Western Front battlefields dominated by machine guns and barbed wire. Romantic notions of mounted charges proved suicidal fantasies when confronted with industrial firepower. Early in the war, cavalry units attempted charges against entrenched positions, suffering catastrophic casualties. Horses were slaughtered wholesale, their bodies littering no man's land. Gradually, cavalry was relegated to reconnaissance, communication, and service in theaters where open warfare remained possible. The Middle East, Eastern Front, where distances were vast and defenses less formidable. Even there, cavalry's effectiveness diminished as war progressed. After the war, most nations reduced or eliminated cavalry units, replacing them with mechanized forces. The cavalry's obsolescence symbolized broader transformation, the end of warfare as romantic adventure and its replacement by industrial slaughter. The last cavalry charges in major combat would occur in World War II's early campaigns, final gestures of tradition surrendering to modernity's inexorable logic. The war's mines and countermines created subterranean battlefields beneath trenches. Specialized tunneling companies dug shafts beneath enemy lines, packing chambers with explosives, detonating them to destroy enemy positions and create breaches for assault. Enemy tunnelers dug their own tunnels, listening for opposing work, sometimes breaking through into enemy tunnels for vicious underground combat with pistols, knives, and explosives in darkness. The psychological strain of tunneling, working underground knowing enemy miners might break through at any moment, that tons of explosives might detonate at any instant, was immense. Some mines failed to detonate during the war and remained beneath former battlefields, occasionally discovered during construction. The largest mines, detonated at Messina's Ridge in June 1917, created explosions heard in London and killed 10,000 men instantly. Mining added three-dimensional aspect to trench warfare, extending battle beneath Earth's surface, making front lines even more complex and terrifying than they appeared above ground. The war's impact on literature extended beyond soldier poets to include civilians processing war's meanings. Women writers like Vera Brittain, who served as nurse, wrote memoirs exploring loss and trauma from perspectives different from male combatants. Rebecca West's novels examined home front's psychological landscape. Virginia Woolf's post-war fiction reflected war's influence on consciousness and narrative structure. Her stream of consciousness technique partly responds to inadequacy of traditional narrative for expressing modern experience. In Germany, Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain used tuberculosis sanatorium as metaphor for European civilization approaching catastrophe. Hermann Hesse explored spiritual crisis in post-war Germany. In France, Henri Barbusse's Under Fire depicted trench warfare's brutal reality. These writers, whether directly describing combat or addressing war's consequences obliquely, created literature grappling with civilization's crisis, searching for meaning or acknowledging meaninglessness, preserving memory while questioning memory's purposes. The war's military cemeteries established by Imperial War Graves Commission reflected democratic principles in death that peacetime societies had not achieved in life. British cemeteries placed officers and enlisted men side by side with identical headstones, radical equality that peacetime class society denied. Each headstone included name, rank, regiment, date of death, age, and optional religious symbol or personal inscription chosen by families. The uniformity expressed idea that all sacrifices were equal, all deaths equally worthy of honor. French cemeteries followed different aesthetics but similar principles. American cemeteries overseas maintained permanent sites where families could visit if they chose not to have remains repatriated. German cemeteries, often darker and more somber, expressed different attitudes toward death and remembrance. These cemeteries became pilgrimage sites, places where families mourned, where nations commemorated, where later generations encountered war's human cost made visible through endless rows of white stones marking individual lives abbreviated. The war's intelligence services expanded dramatically, establishing structures that would persist permanently. Before the war, most nations maintained small intelligence services focused primarily on diplomatic reporting. The war required vast intelligence operations, code-breaking, aerial reconnaissance, prisoner interrogation, espionage networks in occupied territories, counterintelligence against enemy spies, deception operations, propaganda. These activities proved crucial for military and political success. After the war, intelligence services did not disappear but became permanent bureaucracies. Britain's Secret Intelligence Service and Security Service, America's Office of Naval Intelligence and Military Intelligence Division, France's Deuxième Bureau, Germany's Abwehr, all emerged strengthened from war. The war demonstrated that modern states required sophisticated intelligence capabilities, that information was strategic resource as important as material. Intelligence cooperation between allied nations during war established relationships that continued afterward, forming foundations for intelligence alliances that would shape Cold War. The war transformed intelligence from marginal activity to central government function. The war's impact on colonial troops who served European powers included raising expectations that independence would follow loyalty. Indian soldiers served Britain in Europe, Middle East, and Africa, suffering heavy casualties. African soldiers served France throughout the war. Vietnamese and other colonial subjects served France. Australian and New Zealand troops formed Anzac forces that fought at Gallipoli and Western Front, establishing national identities through military service. These troops expected recognition and reward. Indians anticipated movement toward self-governance. Africans expected improved status within empire. Instead, colonial rule continued largely unchanged. In India, the Amritsar massacre in 1919, where British troops fired on unarmed demonstrators, killing hundreds, demonstrated empire's unwillingness to relinquish control. This betrayal radicalized independence movements. Leaders like Gandhi concluded that Britain would not voluntarily grant freedom. Colonial troops' service thus contributed paradoxically to empire's eventual dissolution, by raising expectations that could not be satisfied, by demonstrating that colonized peoples could fight effectively, by revealing European powers' vulnerabilities. The war's archaeological impact on ancient sites in Middle East theaters included damage and looting but also inadvertent discoveries. Military operations in Mesopotamia, Palestine, and other regions occurred across landscapes containing ancient ruins. Some sites suffered damage from military activities, entrenchments, bombardments, camps. Archaeological artifacts were sometimes looted by soldiers seeking souvenirs. But military operations also led to discoveries of previously unknown sites. Officers with archaeological training sometimes documented sites encountered during campaigns. T. Lawrence, who led Arab forces against Ottoman Empire, was trained archaeologist who documented sites. Gertrude Bell worked in Middle East establishing what would become Iraq National Museum. The war brought Western military and administrative personnel into regions rich with archaeological remains, increasing knowledge while also sometimes causing destruction. After the war, archaeological work resumed, benefiting from infrastructure and knowledge accumulated during military operations. The war's impact on Middle Eastern archaeology thus mixed destruction with discovery, tragedy with opportunity. The war's spies included famous figures like Mata Hari and obscure agents whose identities remained classified for decades. Espionage during the war was dangerous, often ineffective, occasionally crucial. Mata Hari, exotic dancer with international connections, was executed by France in 1917 for allegedly spying for Germany, though evidence was questionable and her actual intelligence value minimal. Edith Cavell, British nurse in Belgium, helped Allied soldiers escape occupied territory and was executed by Germany, becoming propaganda martyr. La Dame Blanche network in Belgium provided crucial intelligence to Allies about German troop movements. German spies operated in Britain and France with varying success. The public was fascinated by spy stories, which were sensationalized in press and later in books and films. But real espionage was usually mundane, observing troop movements, photographing documents, recruiting sources, managing communications. The war demonstrated intelligence value while also showing espionage's limitations. Most crucial intelligence came not from spies but from signals intelligence, aerial reconnaissance, and prisoner interrogation. The war's neutral nations faced complex challenges maintaining neutrality while benefiting or suffering from war's economic effects. Switzerland maintained armed neutrality, mobilizing military to defend borders while providing refuge for combatants, diplomats, and spies. Sweden supplied iron ore to Germany while trading with Britain. Netherlands remained neutral despite German violations of its territorial waters. Spain remained neutral partly due to internal political divisions. These nations benefited economically from wartime trade while suffering from blockades, submarine warfare, and diplomatic pressure from both sides to enter conflict or permit violations of neutrality. After the war, neutrals were sometimes resented by belligerents who felt neutrals had profited from others' suffering. But neutrality had required careful diplomacy, military preparedness, and willingness to accept economic hardships. Neutral nations' experiences demonstrated that remaining outside major conflicts required active policies, not merely passive abstention. Their survival as neutrals proved that even in total war, some spaces for non-participation could be maintained through skill and circumstance. The war's labor movements gained strength from workers' essential wartime role but faced post-war repression when attempting to leverage that strength. During the war, labor unions agreed to no-strike pledges in exchange for government consultation on industrial policy and promises of improved conditions. Workers in munitions factories, mines, and shipyards were critical for war effort, giving them bargaining power. Women entering industrial work unionized in some cases. After the war, labor attempted to translate wartime cooperation into permanent gains: higher wages, shorter hours, collective bargaining rights. Major strikes occurred in 1919 in several nations. Governments, no longer needing labor's cooperation, often responded harshly. In United States, steel strike of 1919 was broken by force. In Britain, 1926 general strike failed to achieve objectives. In Germany and Russia, labor movements turned revolutionary, helping bring communists to power. The war strengthened labor organizationally while also demonstrating limits of labor power when governments chose confrontation over accommodation. The war's communication technologies evolved rapidly from field telephones to radio. Early in war, communication between headquarters and frontline units relied on telephone lines strung across battlefields, easily severed by shellfire. Messengers, human runners, dogs, pigeons, carried orders and reports, often dying in transit. Radio technology improved during war, becoming more portable and reliable. By war's end, aircraft used radio to direct artillery fire, tanks carried radios for coordination, headquarters communicated with front lines wirelessly. These advances revolutionized command and control, enabling coordination across larger distances and more complex operations. After the war, radio technology transitioned to civilian use, broadcasting, ship-to-shore communication, amateur radio. The war accelerated development of technologies that would transform civilian life, demonstrating pattern where military necessity drives innovation that later benefits peaceful purposes. But the pattern also raised questions about whether such progress justified war's cost or whether alternative paths to innovation might exist. The war's end saw attempts to prosecute perpetrators of atrocities, establishing precedents for international criminal law. Allied leaders discussed prosecuting Kaiser Wilhelm II and other German leaders for starting aggressive war and committing war crimes. The Versailles Treaty included provisions for trials. Netherlands, where Wilhelm fled, refused extradition. Limited trials were held in Leipzig, Germany, where German courts tried several officers for war crimes. The trials were inadequate, light sentences, acquittals, some convicted prisoners later escaping. But the principle was established that individuals could be held accountable for violations of war's laws, that sovereign immunity did not protect leaders from prosecution for crimes. This principle would be developed further after World War II with Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals, establishing that aggressive war, genocide, and war crimes could result in individual criminal liability under international law. The failed World War I prosecutions taught lessons about need for international courts, effective enforcement, and prosecution while evidence and witnesses remained available. The war's fortifications included not only trenches but elaborate underground cities. Beneath trenches, soldiers dug deep dugouts providing shelter from artillery. Some German dugouts descended 30 feet or more, with electric lighting, ventilation systems, bunks, command posts. French and British dugouts were generally less elaborate but still extensive. The Vauquois Hill in France became honeycomb of tunnels as both sides mined beneath each other. Some underground facilities remain accessible today as museums, allowing visitors to experience claustrophobic conditions soldiers endured. The fortifications represented adaptation to firepower's dominance. Since surface exposure meant death, soldiers moved underground, creating troglodyte existence. Some men spent weeks underground, emerging only at night. The psychological effects of prolonged subterranean living added to combat stress. The fortifications demonstrated human ingenuity applied to survival but also warfare's dehumanizing effects. Men became moles, burrowing into earth. Their natural environment transformed into death trap from which underground tunnels provided only partial refuge. The war's children, those who grew up during conflict years, formed generation marked by deprivation and loss. Many lost fathers. Food shortages caused malnutrition, affecting physical and cognitive development. Education was disrupted. Children worked in factories replacing adult workers who had gone to war. In combat zones, children experienced bombardment, occupation, evacuation. Some became orphans. After the war, child welfare organizations attempted to address the crisis, but resources were limited. The war children generation carried physical and psychological effects throughout their lives. Many harbored hatred for enemy nations that had killed their fathers or destroyed their homes. Some became pacifists, determined to prevent future wars. Others embraced militarism, seeking to avenge losses. This generation came of age during the 1930s, their attitudes shaped by childhood wartime experiences, influencing whether they supported or opposed renewed conflict. The war thus shaped not only those who fought but subsequent generation, transmitting trauma across years, ensuring that war's effects extended decades beyond armistice. The war's logistics of death, burying millions of bodies, posed unprecedented challenges. In active combat zones, burial was often hasty or impossible. Bodies lay in no man's land for weeks or months. After major battles, burial details worked for days, interring the dead in mass graves or individual plots. Identification was difficult. Some soldiers wore identity discs, others carried personal items. Many were unidentifiable. Bodies were frequently dismembered or decomposed beyond recognition. Graves registration services attempted to record burial locations, but records were incomplete. After the war, bodies were reburied in permanent cemeteries when possible. Some remains were repatriated at families' request. Others remained where they fell. Periodically, construction projects or agricultural work uncovers remains that are analyzed using modern forensic techniques including DNA analysis, sometimes allowing identification and proper burial decades later. The persistence of unburied or unidentified remains demonstrates war's physical legacy, how violence inscribed itself into landscapes so thoroughly that Earth itself became memorial, cemetery, and warning. The war's final months saw Spanish flu pandemic ravaging armies and civilian populations simultaneously. Soldiers in close quarters proved especially vulnerable to respiratory infection. The virus spread rapidly through camps, trenches, transport ships. Sick soldiers could not fight effectively, weakening military operations. Some historians argue the pandemic contributed to war's end by degrading military effectiveness on both sides, though Central Powers suffered more severely due to malnutrition from blockade. After armistice, demobilization spread the virus globally as soldiers returned home. The pandemic killed more people than the war itself, perhaps 50 to 100 million deaths worldwide. It seemed as if humanity, having survived 4 years of mechanized slaughter, now faced natural punishment equally deadly. The pandemic's coincidence with war's end created apocalyptic atmosphere, sense that world was ending or fundamentally transforming. For those who survived both war and pandemic, the experience reinforced perception that they had lived through unprecedented historical rupture, that nothing would ever be same again. The war's legacies are still debated, interpreted, contested more than a century later. Historians argue about war's causes, whether it was inevitable or preventable, who bore responsibility. They debate military strategies, were offensives necessary or futile, were casualties justified by objectives, could different tactics have shortened the war. They examine social impacts, how war changed gender relations, class structures, political systems. They trace war's consequences through interwar period, World War II, Cold War, arguing about causation's limits and complexity. The war remains relevant because we still inhabit world it created, nation-states it established, conflicts it initiated, technologies it developed, ideologies it empowered. Understanding the war matters not merely for historical knowledge but for comprehending present conditions and avoiding future catastrophes. But understanding remains incomplete, contested, evolving as new generations ask new questions, discover new sources, interpret evidence through contemporary concerns. The war, though long over, continues in memory, scholarship, and imagination, refusing to recede into past, insisting on present relevance. Close your eyes. The guns are silent now, their thunder fading into echoes that merge with the darkness of your room. You are no longer in the trenches, no longer in that summer of 1914 when the world stood golden and unaware. You are here in your bed in the safety of this present moment. The soldiers have come home or found their rest. The empires have fallen into dust. The treaties have been signed and broken and signed again. Feel the weight of your blanket, the softness of your pillow. The mud of Flanders has dried. The wire has rusted. The poppies have bloomed and withered and bloomed again through seasons beyond counting. Let the stories settle into memory, into history, into sleep. If you found meaning in these whispered histories, please subscribe to Whispered Empires and press the bell icon for more journeys through time's quiet corridors. And leave a like if this story moved you, so others might find their way here too. Now rest, let go, drift into dreams where the past cannot follow. The Great War is over. You are safe. You are home. Sleep now.